Hello, I'm Casey O'Connor Willis. I work at the NYU Stern Center for Business and Human Rights, where my work is focused on understanding and improving the S or social category of ESG investing. This most recent research is looking at how the S is factoring into ESG strategies and practices since the recent boom in demand for these strategies has occurred in the last 5 or so years. At a high level, we're interested in understanding the S in part because the majority of these funds are still oriented toward environmental factors exclusively, often climate change. And while this makes a great deal of sense, given the existential threat that climate change presents to our collective well-being, there are also social threats that have become increasingly visible in the context, particularly of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the background of this research is that we are trying to understand the current state of social and to recommend one priority social concern that we think investors ought to take on in order to help this category catch up to the environmental and governance counterparts. So at the outset, I'll say that there are a number of reasons why the social category has lagged behind the environmental and governance categories. One is that a company's social effects are vast and varied, and so it can be a very difficult category to pin down. Also, what constitutes good performance on social issues is often more contested, and so it can be hard. It lacks sort of scientific targets that help to clarify environmental performance. And information on social performance is often very difficult to come by. And so for all of these reasons, the relationship between social performance is also with financial performance is also less well understood. So against this backdrop, there is an interest nonetheless, in large part arising out of the pandemic, in focusing greater attention on the social category from institutional investors. And so we recommend that asset owners and asset managers begin trying to address and close the social gap by focusing on the declining quality of low-wage work and the widening economic divide between high and low skilled workers that became both evident during the pandemic and was also exacerbated by the pandemic. So these are tremendously large and complicated social problems, but we do think that ESG investing can be a part of the toolkit that can be brought to bear to address these problems over time. But that will require some pretty significant changes in current approaches to social assessment in order to make that an effective tool to solving that problem. So this research is really focused on how the S would need to change in order to better address low-wage jobs. As background on what exactly we did, this research entailed a pretty broad review of academic studies in order to understand what firm-level drivers of worsening low-wage work and rising income inequality are. So we looked at over 200 academic studies from fields including finance, accounting, management, corporate governance, and economics to see what empirical studies had found those drivers to be. And then we looked at current ESG practices and we evaluated them to assess the degree to which these drivers are reflected in current social assessments. What we found is that there's pretty substantial agreement at this point that at a firm level, outsourcing and automation have been the major drivers, firm level drivers of rising income inequality and declining low-wage work. And we opted then to focus on outsourcing because it introduces ongoing operational and labor risks that companies must manage. And this means that it creates an opportunity for investors both to encourage and to benefit from better outsourcing practices over time. But we also found, unsurprisingly, given the general challenges with S that I mentioned earlier, we found that the information on the treatment of outsourced workers is almost non-existent. And the way that most ESG funds and ratings have responded to this is either by ignoring this portion of the workforce altogether, or by relying on things such as policies or the volume of social audits that lead firms conduct to understand the treatment of their outsourced workforce. But we also saw, particularly in the labor economics literature, that these have not proven to be very effective predictors of labor practices over time. So we are now recommending that for ESG to improve low-wage work, social assessments really have to come up with creative new ways to assess the full workforce that companies rely on. We think that at this stage, because the information is so poor and because which information is going to be most useful is also unclear, that asset owners and asset managers focus on more active stewardship as a first step to closing this gap. This will allow them in kind of rich context to understand what additional information the companies ought to be gathering and disclosing, and what good performance with respect to those metrics looks like over time. So some of the kinds of information that might ultimately be desirable to see from companies with respect to their outsourced workforce could include things like turnover rates, wage bill, contract types. But what is useful is likely to be company specific, industry specific. And so we think that beginning with more active stewardship and deeper conversations with companies to determine what those best metrics are makes sense at this stage. Over time, this would help to put more high quality information on the table, and that would allow a wider variety of funds to incorporate this kind of information into their strategies, and again, to understand over time the relationship between better outsourcing practices in terms of outsourcing practices that encourage better treatment of low-wage workers, the relationship between those practices and financial performance and operational risks over time. And so at the end of this research, we propose a preliminary framework of metrics that investors could use in order to prioritize which companies merit deeper engagement and to help direct them to the kinds of questions or the kinds of issues they might raise in order to better understand how a company is managing its labor risks in its outsourced workforce. For those who are interested in learning more, we've just put out this report, and in the appendix, you can find an overview of the early thoughts that we have about this new approach for assessing labor risk. So this will be essentially a screening tool that asset owners and managers could use to identify which companies most merit engagement. And it is derived from 3 intersecting corporate attributes. So it's looking at where cost-cutting incentives are particularly pronounced, along with where companies have particularly large or increasing power imbalances in their purchasing relationships, and finally their exposure to vulnerable workforces. So these 3 attributes together, we anticipate will help to predict companies where there is a greater risk of reliance on chronically poor or even illegal labor practices over time. And you can find this again as the appendix to the report that we've just published, Making ESG Work.